Please welcome Dr. Dean Ornish.
Thank you.
Great to have you.
Thanks. Thank you. It's really great to be here. Wasn't that a great talk from the brilliant Dr. Brilliant? It's just fantastic. So I want to first thank Mark Benioff for including me here and for including all of us here and for his great vision. And I want to talk with you today about the power of the cloud as a healing force, and I'll come back to that. You know, we tend to think of advances in medicine as being a new drug, a new laser, something really high-tech and expensive. And we often have a hard time believing that the simple choices that we make in our lives each day, like what we eat, how we respond to stress, how much exercise we get, and perhaps most important, what we call psychosocial support, but it's really the kinds of things that you do at Salesforce.com, bringing people together, not only to sell more things, but as a healing force, which I'll come back to. And if you had to reduce it down to one sentence, it's really about the power of addressing the cause, in this case, of what makes us sick. You know, we spend so much time in medicine mopping up the floor around the sink that's overflowing without also turning off the faucet. That's how I got interested in doing this work when I was learning how to do bypass surgery with Michael DeBakey, the heart surgeon. We'd cut people open, we'd bypass their blocked arteries, he'd tell them they were cured, and more often than not, they would go home and do the same things that had caused the problem in the first place. Eat junk food, smoke, not manage stress, not exercise. And then we'd often have to cut them open again and bypass the bypass, sometimes 2 or 3 times. So for me, bypass surgery became a metaphor of an incomplete approach. But if we can turn off the faucet around that sink that's overflowing, if we can treat the cause, what we've been able to show is that our bodies have a remarkable capacity to begin healing themselves, and much more quickly than we had once realized. And so we're using these very high-tech, expensive, state-of-the-art measures to prove the power of these very simple and low-tech and low-cost and often ancient interventions. And we all know that lifestyle changes can help prevent disease. We've been able to show that you can actually reverse the most common diseases, which is not only more effective in many cases, but a whole lot more cost-effective. And all these things were thought impossible before we were able to show that they could actually be done. To me, that's part of the value of science, is you can actually show and prove that things can give people new hope and new choices. We began with heart disease. If you see a picture on the upper left, it shows one of the arteries that's narrowed. It's an X-ray, a frame from an X-ray movie called an angiogram. And where the arrow is where it's blocked there, so the blood can't get through to feed the heart. A year later, in the upper right, you can see it's wider. And because the blood flow is an exponential function, even small changes in the blockages can cause big changes in the blood flow. And what you're seeing on the lower left is what's called a cardiac PET scan. And blue and black means no blood flow. You can see there's a big part of the heart in the lower left picture that's not getting enough blood flow. But a year later in the lower right, it's turned orange and white, which means that it's getting a normal amount of blood flow. That had never been shown before. And so if you looked at all the arteries in all the patients, in the red line, they got worse after 1 year and even worse after 5 years. These were the control group or comparison group of people who were making more moderate changes. They didn't go far enough to even keep the disease from getting worse. But in the green line at the bottom, there was some reversal of the arteries. The arteries got less clogged after 1 year and even less clogged after 5 years. I want to just show you a video, put a human face on this.
25 years ago, I had 5 restaurants in San Francisco. It was a great life. I smoked 6 cigars a day, 10 cups of coffee, a lot of wine. It was wonderful. And I had a massive heart attack. I was in the hospital for 2 weeks. I could hardly just about walk 3 steps, and I'd have to stop and rest. I was popping 20 or 30 nitros a day. But then Dean Ornish was starting his program to see if you can reverse heart disease through lifestyle change. And he went to my doctor and asked if he could approach me. He told Dean, "How long is the program?" So he said it was a year. And my doctor told him he wouldn't recommend taking me because he didn't think I would live the year. So he figured I was going to die because I was in such bad shape. And now, 25 years later, and I'm in pretty good shape.
So I wanted to show that this, by the way, is from a documentary film called Escape Fire that'll be opening in theaters nationwide on October the 5th. And the filmmakers hope to do for integrative medicine what An Inconvenient Truth did for global warming, to really raise awareness about that. But I wanted to show you as an example of why I'm so passionate about doing this work. I mean, this is a guy who literally couldn't walk across the street without getting chest pain. He couldn't have sex. He couldn't work. He couldn't take a shower without getting pain. And within a few weeks, he was essentially pain-free. And he's remained that way now for 25 years. And so this is not our best case. This is representative of what people do when they make these simple changes. People think it has to be a new drug or a new laser, something really high-tech, as I mentioned earlier. And it's often hard for people to believe what a powerful change these simple things can do. One of the interesting findings was that the more people changed, the more they improved. It wasn't how old or how sick they were. The more you change, the better you get. We then looked at prostate cancer. You know, prostate cancer is the #1 cancer in men, other than skin cancer. And the latest studies are showing that the treatments really don't work that well, that only 1 out of 49 men who has prostate cancer lives longer because of that. The other 48 tend to become either impotent or incontinent or both for no benefit. And so we wanted to see what would happen if people changed their lifestyle. So we took men who had biopsy-proven cancer. We did this in collaboration with the chair of urology at UCSF, Dr. Peter Carroll, and the former late chair of urology at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in New York. And what we found is that these were men who had biopsy-proven prostate cancer, but who had elected not to be treated for reasons unrelated to the study, the so-called watchful waiting. So we could then look at the effects of lifestyle changes alone without being confounded by radiation and surgery and so on. And what we found was that the PSA levels, which as you know is a marker for prostate cancer, went up or got worse in the comparison group who didn't make changes to this degree, but went down or got better in the group that did. And here again, the more people changed their diet and lifestyle, the lower their PSAs went. When we actually looked at the tumor growth in vitro, we found the prostate tumor growth was inhibited 70% in the group that made these lifestyle changes, but only 9% in the group that didn't. And in one of the coolest slides, we found the more people changed their diet and lifestyle, the more it directly inhibited the growth of their tumors. That's a really good, exciting thing. And we actually measured the tumor activity shown in red using a new test called MR spectroscopy, and we found that the tumor growth began to shrink after a year in these patients. And so this remains the first and only randomized trial showing that lifestyle changes may slow, stop, and even reverse the progression of early-stage prostate cancer. So we wondered what were some of the mechanisms by which this might happen. And so we looked at the gene expression, and we found that over 500 genes were changed in just 3 months. In fact, turning on the good genes that prevent prostate cancer and turning off the bad genes that cause it. And not only the genes that cause prostate cancer, but they're also the same genes that promote breast cancer and colon cancer as well. This is what's called a heat map. Red is turned on, green is turned off, and each one of those along the right column is one of the oncogenes that promote cancer. And you can see how dramatic these changes can occur even in your genes. And because of a phenomenon called epigenetics, when you change your genes, the gene expression, those better genes now get transmitted to your kids as well. Another study showed that meditation alone can actually change your genes. This was a study done by Jeff Dusek at Harvard. And you can see that the more people meditated, the more their gene expression changed. It goes from red to more green as you go across the top, and from green to more red as you go across the bottom. Now, we did a study with Dr. Elizabeth Blackburn, who has discovered an enzyme called telomerase, which promotes healing of your telomeres. Now, your telomeres are the ends of your chromosomes that control how long you live. As your telomeres get shorter, your life gets shorter. And she and Dr. Alyssa Epel and others did a pioneering study where she found that women who were under chronic emotional stress because they were caretakers of kids with autism or parents with Alzheimer's, the more stress they felt and the longer they felt stress, the lower their telomerase and the shorter were their telomeres. In other words, it was the first study showing that chronic emotional stress can shorten your lifespan by shortening your telomeres. What was interesting, though, it wasn't the stress itself, it was how people interacted with that made a difference. So you could have 2 women who were in the same environment, but one was managing it better through meditation, through exercise, through counseling, through any other number of different ways they could do that. And so the stress isn't just out there that really matters, it's how you react to what's out there that matters. So we were at a conference together, and I said, we had lunch, and I said, if bad things make your telomeres shorter, maybe good things can make them longer. And so we did a study, and we found that in just 3 months, the telomerase, which makes your telomeres longer, increased by 30%. And even drugs haven't been shown to do that. And we're about to publish the first study after 5 years showing that the telomeres themselves can get almost 10% longer, whereas they got shorter in the group that didn't make changes to this degree. I find that really exciting. And we also found that the more people changed their diet and lifestyle, the longer their telomeres got. I think that's a powerful message, and it's kind of an antidote to what I call genetic nihilism, the people who say, oh, I've got bad genes, what can I do? Well, it turns out you can do a lot, not to blame, but to empower, because otherwise you're just a victim, of bad genes or bad fate or whatever. We can actually do something about that. Finally, we looked at something called angiogenesis. Now, when tumors grow, they secrete substances like VEGF that promote blood vessels to grow to feed the tumor. It's called angiogenesis, new blood vessels. And if you can disrupt the flow of blood, you can kill the tumor without having to have the toxicities of chemotherapy. And there are drugs like Avastin and Nexavar and others that can do that, but they cost $100,000 per year per patient. We found that we could downregulate that by the same degree that you can with the drugs at a fraction of the cost, and the only side effects are good ones. Now, so often people say, well, that all sounds great, but I don't think I could change my lifestyle. It's too hard. And so having been doing this now for 35 years, we learn what enables people to make sustainable changes. I'm 96, by the way. I don't know if you look pretty good, I think. And it's not what I thought when I first started doing it. I tried to scare people into change, like most doctors do. Don't eat that cheeseburger, you're going to get a heart attack. Quit smoking, you're going to get lung cancer. And you know what? It doesn't work. Not only does it not work, it's sometimes actually counterproductive. What enables people to make sustainable changes is not fear of dying, it's joy of living. If it's fun, if you feel free, if it's pleasurable, and if it's loving, then it's sustainable. But the problem is that the whole concept of risk factor modification, don't smoke because something bad may happen to you later, take your Lipitor to prevent something bad from happening, is fear-based. And fear is not a sustainable motivator in anything, but particularly in changing lifestyle. I mean, we're all going to die, right? What's the mortality rate in this room? It's 100%, right? I don't want to be the first to break the news to you, but it's 1 per person, right? And so I've just found that efforts to try to motivate people to change out of fear of dying don't work that well, or fear of something really bad like a heart attack or stroke, because people don't want to think about it. And this goes all the way back to the first dietary intervention, when God said don't eat the apple, and that didn't work, and that was God talking, so we're not going to do better than that. And if you tell kids that smoking is dangerous, that just makes it cool, like James Dean on a Harley. And so not only is it not helpful, it's actually counterproductive. And so we've learned that it really needs to be fun and joy-based, not fear-based. The cartoon says, I give smokers a discount because there's not as much to tell. That's the fear-based approach that doesn't work very well. And people think, well, taking a pill like Lipitor or Zocor, one of these pills is easy, everybody will do it. Changing diet and lifestyle is difficult, if not impossible, and nobody's going to do it. But in fact, the opposite is what we found. That the drug companies are finding that only 30% of people are taking their statin drugs like Lipitor after just 3 months, even if someone else is paying for it, even if there are no side effects. And why is that? Because again, it's fear-based. Take this pill to prevent something really awful like a heart attack or a stroke that you don't want to think about, and so you don't. But when you change your lifestyle, you feel so much better so quickly, it reframes the reason for making these changes from fear to joy, and it's joy that's sustainable. And we found that we could reduce cholesterol levels to the same degree or greater than these drugs, which cost billions of dollars per year, for free, simply by making bigger changes in diet and lifestyle. Now, it makes sense. There's no point in giving up something that you enjoy unless you get something back that's better and quickly. It's a beautiful day here in San Francisco. You could be out doing a lot of other things, but you're here, and hopefully it's worth it. We're always making these kinds of choices. But because these biological mechanisms are so dynamic, you don't have to wait. It's not about living to be 86 instead of 85. That doesn't really motivate most people, even when they're 85. It's really about feeling good. And because these biological mechanisms are so dynamic, most people really feel better very quickly. When you eat healthier, when you manage stress, when you exercise, when you have more love in your life, your brain gets more blood and more oxygen. You think more clearly, you have more energy, you need less sleep. You even can grow so many new brain neurons that your brain can actually get bigger in just 3 months. Now, when I was in medical school, we were taught that, if you went out and had a couple six-packs one day, you'd kill off 1,000 or so of your brain cells, you'd never get them back. It turns out not to be true. Your brain can grow new brain cells so quickly that your brain can actually get bigger just by making these changes. Just walking a half hour a day was enough to cause brain cells to grow so much that people's brains got bigger. And these are two of the most prestigious scientific journals. And I like this slide because it gets away from the idea of austerity and deprivation. Some of my favorite things actually promote brain growth, neurogenesis, like chocolate and tea and blueberries increase neurogenesis, but things that are bad for your heart are bad for your brain as well, like saturated fat, sugar, and nicotine. Moderate alcohol increases neurogenesis, but excessive kills it. Stress management is good, chronic stress is bad. Moderate exercise can increase neurogenesis. Believe it or not, even cannabinoids can increase neurogenesis. What were we just talking about? Never mind. Whereas drugs like cocaine and stimulants are bad for your brain. And sex, believe it or not, can increase neurogenesis. This was a study, they couldn't get any human volunteers for this because they had to have them have sex and then kill them a couple of weeks later. So these are in mice, but you can see that just 2 weeks of active sex promotes brain growth. So one of your homework assignments when you go back to your the places you came from, no, I'm just kidding. We'll come back to that. And your skin gets more blood, so it slows the aging process. In fact, one of the most effective anti-smoking ads was from Christy Turlington, the supermodel, whose father died of lung cancer. So she has this wonderful website called smokingisugly.com because nicotine constricts your arteries. So in your heart, that can cause a heart attack. In your brain, it can cause a stroke. But in your face, it causes you to wrinkle faster because those little capillaries clamp down and give you that kind of gray pallor. It causes you to look 10 or 20 years older. And one of the other things that people don't know is that half of guys who smoke are impotent because it's the anti-Viagra. It constricts the blood vessels to your sexual organs. And so one of the most effective anti-smoking ads was done by the Department of Health Services here in California. And they got this actor and they dressed him up like the Marlboro Man. And they had these huge billboards that looked like this. And you'll notice it doesn't say heart attack, lung cancer, emphysema. It says impotence because that puts it into the here and now. And so instead of saying smoking is bad for you or it's dangerous, which just makes it cool, it's instead of saying it makes you beautiful and sexy, which is what the ads show, it actually makes you ugly and impotent. That puts it into the here and now, not something bad that might happen down the road. And that makes a big difference. And here again, the primary determinant of all these things that we measured, the more you change, the more you improve. And the more you improve, the better you feel. And the better you feel, you get into this virtuous cycle that you want to keep doing it. Because again, there's no point in giving up something that you like unless you get something back that's better and quickly. And that's what happens here. And if you go on a diet, half of Americans now are on some kind of diet. And the problem is if you go on a diet, you're going to go off a diet. I have an op-ed coming out in the New York Times this Sunday that I talk about this in more detail than we have time for here. But diets are all about what you can't have and what you must do. And they're all about making people feel constricted. And part of what I've learned is that even more than being healthy, people want to feel free and in control. And as soon as I say, eat this and don't eat that and do this and don't do that, people will kind of hunch up their shoulders and they go, yes, doctor, and they immediately want to do just the opposite. So it's not only not helpful, but it's counterproductive. So that makes you feel all those toxic emotions of shame and guilt and anger and humiliation, which only make it worse. And might as well just finish the pint of ice cream at that point. And so we got to get away from this idea of food as a moral issue in the sense of good foods and bad foods. As soon as you call some foods bad, then you're a bad person if you ate bad foods, and then you might as well finish the cheeseburger at that point. I can't go out to dinner without someone either apologizing for what they're eating or commenting on what I'm eating. I have to go, I'm not the food police, you're forgiven. But that whole moralistic idea we got to get away from. And so I came up with this idea called a spectrum. And the spectrum is based on the idea that foods aren't good or bad, but some foods are healthier for you than others. And so I just categorized foods from the most healthy, group 1, to the least healthful, group 5, and said what matters most is your overall way of eating and living. So if you indulge yourself one day, it doesn't mean you cheated or you're bad or you failed. Just eat healthier the next. If you don't have time to exercise one day, do a little more the next. If you don't have time to meditate for 20 minutes, do it for 1 minute. Whatever you can do, the more you change, the more you improve. And then you can't fail. And so it's a much more compassionate way of doing this, and it's a much more sustainable. And so I put together this little video clip that talks about this that I want to show you in a moment. But it's based on you decide how much you want to change. I chaired Google's Health Advisory Board for a couple of years, and like Larry, had the opportunity to spend a lot of time with some really smart Google engineers. And I thought, let's come up with this really sophisticated model and all these algorithms where you can plug in your health risk assessments and questionnaires and your DNA testing, and then here's your personalized lifestyle program. And one day I realized, I'm going about this in completely the wrong way. I don't know if you've ever had these moments where you realize you're not doing it in the right way. And I said, instead of me telling you what you should be doing, you can tell me how much you want to change and how quickly. Let's make it radically simple, because we know the more you change, the more you improve. So instead of me telling you what you should be doing, you tell me how much you want to change, how quickly, how many things, and then we'll track it. And if that degree of change is enough to accomplish your goals, great. If not, you can do more. So let's say you want to get your cholesterol down 50 points, or lower your blood pressure 10 points, or your blood sugar, or lose 10 pounds, or whatever it is. And you say, well, I'm not ready to go all the way to eating super healthy, but I'll eat a little healthier, and I'll do a little more exercise, a little meditation, a little more love in my life, and then we'll see if that's enough. And if it came down 30 points, but you wanted to come down 50, then you know you can do more. So here's a little graphic that makes it easy to understand. Thank you. So as I mentioned, all foods are included, so there's no diet to get on, so there's no diet to get off, and that makes it much more sustainable. Now, I'm sure you've heard, all this conflicting information about, what you should be eating. And the good news is that there's really a convergence of what constitutes an optimal way of eating that most experts are agreeing on. It goes something like this. You want to consume mostly plants, fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, soy products, in their natural and unrefined forms. Michael Pollan likes to say, if it came from a plant, eat it, and if it's made in a plant, avoid it. And to use meat more as a flavoring or as a special occasion food. And to eat food as close as possible in its natural form because it preserves all the fiber and so on. And to, as he says, avoid processed foods with ingredients a third grader can't pronounce. And my favorite is don't eat breakfast cereals that change the color of the milk. You want to reduce your intake of total fat because fat is so dense in calories. If you eat less fat, you're going to get fewer calories even if you eat the same amount of food, and particularly the so-called bad fats, the trans fats, the hydrogenated fats, and the saturated fats. Also, you want to reduce your intake of sodium, and particularly you want to reduce your intake of sugar and refined carbohydrates, sugar, white flour, white rice. The problem is when you eat a lot of sugar, when you go from brown rice to white rice or from whole wheat flour to white flour, you're removing the fiber in the bran. And the fiber was what ordinarily slows the absorption, so you don't get those rapid spikes in blood sugar that you see on the left, which causes an insulin response, which makes your blood sugar go down. It's like a pendulum. When you pull it to one side, it goes too far to the other. That low blood sugar makes you crave more carbohydrates in a vicious cycle. But when you eat whole grains and fruits and vegetables that are rich in fiber, the fiber slows the absorption, so you get a much more constant level of blood sugar. It gives you a constant level of energy. You don't get those mood swings, and you don't get those insulin surges that accelerate the conversion of calories into fat and can lead to diabetes. And half of Americans are going to be diabetic or pre-diabetic in the next 8 years. Half of Americans. And the complications of diabetes are not good. Amputations, impotence, heart attacks, strokes, kidney failure, blindness, completely preventable if you simply change your diet and lifestyle. What we include in our diet is as important as what we exclude, as we talked about. 4 grams a day of fish oil can reduce your incidence of sudden cardiac death by up to 80%. So if you don't remember anything else, remember that. And you want to eat organic if you can because it tastes better as well as being better for you. And choose quality over quantity. So if you have foods that really taste good and you eat them mindfully, then you get more pleasure with fewer calories. And how you eat is as important as what you eat. In our website at ornish.com, my wife Ann, who's here, has a wonderful guided meditation called Eating with Ecstasy. So if you can, I don't know about you, if you've ever gone to a movie theater and you're eating some popcorn while you're watching a great movie and you kind of look down and the bag of popcorn's empty, it's like, who ate this? So you've got all the calories and not much of the pleasure. If you really focus on something and eat it the same way that you would savor a fine wine, like a piece of dark chocolate, for example, works for me, then you can get more pleasure with fewer calories. And so you can get, and the pleasure, again, is what makes it sustainable. Now, moving to another topic, there's a globalization of chronic disease that's going on as other countries are starting to eat like us and live like us and all too often die like us. This has all happened in the last 20 years. It's a different pandemic than the one that Dr. Brilliant was talking about. And because of that, more people are dying today of heart disease and diabetes than AIDS, TB, and malaria combined. And what's good for you is good for the planet. What's personally sustainable is globally sustainable. There are three major crises that are going on now that just can seem overwhelming, like what can I do as one person to make a difference? The energy crisis, the global warming crisis, and the health crisis. Well, let's take them one at a time. Many people are surprised that 20% of the fossil fuel that we burn goes to produce processed foods. So when you eat more whole foods, you can reduce the consumption of energy. And when you eat lower on the food chain, when you eat more fruits and vegetables and less meat, it frees up a lot of resources because it takes 10 times more energy to produce animal-based protein than plant-based protein. It also, it takes a quarter pounder with cheese takes 26 ounces of petroleum and leaves a 13-pound carbon footprint. That's equivalent to burning 7 pounds of coal. Now, I'm not saying everybody needs to go out and be a vegetarian, but if you just had a meatless Monday or just had fewer burgers, whatever you do, it's just like on yourself. The more you change, the more you improve. It's true for the planet. Even small changes, when we add them up, as we've all seen in the cloud, can make a big difference. From a global warming standpoint, many people are surprised that livestock consumption causes more global warming than all forms of transportation combined. And so it's responsible for 18% of the world's total greenhouse gas emissions, which compares only 13% of the entire global transportation system. So here again, what's good for you is good for the planet. And we're having a big debate now in the election about how we're going to deal with this huge deficit that we have. Well, it turns out that a big part of that, as you all know, are Medicare costs and health costs, which are really sick costs because 3/4 of the $2.7 or $2.8 trillion in healthcare costs are due to chronic diseases, and most of them can be not only prevented but even reversed simply by changing diet and lifestyle. And so we've got many Republicans who are saying, let's privatize Medicare and dismantle it. Many Democrats saying, let's just raise taxes, let the deficit go up. There's not a lot of common ground there. But we're saying, wait a minute, there's a third alternative. If we can turn off the faucet around that sink that's overflowing that we talked about earlier, if we can treat the cause of the problem, which are to a large degree these lifestyle changes and choices that we make each day, we can make better health care available to more people at lower costs, and only the side effects are good ones. And just to give an example of that, the EPIC study showed that, which was an EPIC study, showed in large numbers of people just moderate changes, eating a reasonably healthy diet, walking, and keeping a healthy weight, prevented 93% of diabetes. Now think about it. Half of Americans are going to be diabetic or pre-diabetic in the next 8 years at a cost of over $3 trillion. And it's completely preventable today just by eating and living healthier. Heart attacks. Heart disease kills more people than everything else combined, and yet at least 95% and probably 99% of heart attacks are completely preventable today. We don't need a new breakthrough. We don't need to wait for a new drug or a new laser or something really high-tech. We just need to put into practice what we already know. That's what a difference it can make. And in Mark's brilliant keynote address a few days ago, he talked about the new HR human resources software that Salesforce is developing. So I know many of you deal with those kinds of issues. Many of you are CIOs and CEOs and so on. And this is really now reaching the CEO level because Starbucks spends more money on healthcare for their employees than they do for coffee beans. Mars Candy more than they do for sugar. General Motors more than they do for steel. And so it's really affecting the bottom line. In 2005, Steve Bird, the CEO of Safeway here in the Bay Area, approached me and he said, we're spending 120% of our net revenues on healthcare for our employees. That's not sustainable in any business. And so he put into the work site many of these same principles, and in the first year, the cost came down 11%, and they've remained essentially flat since then. But because these biological mechanisms are so dynamic, the economic benefits occur very quickly as well. And it provides a third alternative to how we're going to deal with these costs. Now, we've done 3 demonstration projects. One we did with Mutual of Omaha, and they found most people who were told they needed a bypass or angioplasty could safely avoid it simply by making these lifestyle changes instead. And they saved $30,000 per patient in the first year. So when lifestyle is offered as treatment, you can show the cost savings very quickly. Highmark Blue Cross Blue Shield found, compared to a matched control group, that they cut their costs by 50% in the first year. Now, if we have $2.8 trillion in healthcare costs, imagine if we could cut that in half in the first year, how much resources that would free up for doing other things. And we found that there's 85 to 90% adherence to our program after a year in all of these 24 sites in West Virginia, Nebraska, and Pennsylvania. So compare that to 30% adherence to drugs like Lipitor at 3 months. So the idea that taking a pill is easy and everybody will do it, but changing diet and lifestyle is difficult, if not impossible, is the opposite of what we're finding. And the reason is because you feel better when you make these changes. And this isn't, West Virginia was #1 in the country in heart disease the last several years. So it's a little like Frank Sinatra used to sing, if I can make it in West Virginia, I can make it anywhere, right? Now, as I mentioned earlier, Medicare is now covering our program. And that's important because, what's going on over there? Thank you. Never had that happen before. That's important because I used to think if we just did good science, that would change medical practice. But I realized that with all this talk about evidence-based medicine, reimbursement is a much more powerful determinant. And so Medicare will now pay for our program in all the sites that we're training. And so we're in the process of rapidly expanding that. And if you're interested in learning more about our work, which also includes a lot of meditations and menus and recipes, and it's all free, just go to our website. It's all there. Just to show you how powerful these changes are, and thousands of people we've worked with, this is beginning 12 weeks, 1 year, a 16-pound weight loss, sustainable after a year. Chest pain goes down dramatically like you saw in the film. The ability to exercise goes up and stays up. The old joke is if I change my diet and lifestyle, am I going to live longer? Is it just going to seem longer? And fortunately, the quality of life improves dramatically and stays up. Blood pressure, systolic blood pressure goes down and stays down. We get people off their blood pressure drugs. Their diastolic blood pressure goes down as well. I mean, when you go to your doctor and you've got high blood pressure, high cholesterol, et cetera, they say, take these pills. And you say, how long do I have to take them? They say, forever. It's like, well, wait a minute. It's kind of like the cartoon of the doctor mopping up the floor around the sink that's overflowing. How long do I have to keep mopping up the floor? Well, forever. We've got all these kind of mops and brooms and everything you can use. And you say, wait a minute, why don't we just turn off the faucet? And what we find is we can get people off their medications, off their blood pressure pills, off their diabetes medications, off their cholesterol-lowering drugs, under their doctor's supervision, of course. When you treat the cause, your body can begin to heal. The diabetes, the blood sugar goes back to normal. Now, the last thing that I want to talk with you about, which to me is the most important and I think has the most direct relevance to what you all do with Salesforce.com, is that the real epidemic isn't just heart disease or diabetes or H1N1 or those kinds of things, as important as they are. It's loneliness and depression and isolation is the real pandemic. I mean, the #1 category of prescription drugs the last 20 years has been antidepressants because there are a lot of depressed people out there. And so we all know that being depressed affects the quality of life, but it actually affects our survival and to a much larger degree than we had once realized. People who are lonely and depressed and isolated are 3 to 10 times more likely to get sick and die prematurely than those who have a sense of love and connection and community. In part because you're more likely to eat badly. People say things like, I've got 20 friends in this pack of cigarettes and they're always there for me and nobody else is. You're going to take away my 20 friends? What are you going to give me? Or food fills that void, or fat coats my nerves and numbs the pain, or alcohol numbs the pain, or other drugs numb the pain, or working all the time is a more socially acceptable way of numbing the pain. I'm sure many of you have tried that. It works pretty well, but it doesn't really treat the cause. And to me, the pain is not the problem. The pain is the messenger. It's saying, hey, listen up, pay attention. You're not doing something that's in your best interest. And if we just kill the pain, it's a little like cutting the wires to a fire alarm without putting out the fire. The problem just gets worse. The pain is not the problem, the pain is the messenger. And so what we've learned is that if we just give information, that's not enough. If information were enough, nobody would smoke. It's not like people don't know it's bad for you. You have to say, we have to work at a deeper level. And so what we find is that when we can treat the underlying cause, which is often that loneliness and depression and isolation, it makes a huge difference. Let me just show you how big a difference that can make. This was a study that was done in the Journal of the American Medical Association where they looked at men and women after a heart attack. 6 months after they had a heart attack, those that were depressed, about 17% were dead. Those that weren't depressed, about 4% were dead. You know, greater than fourfold difference in mortality 6 months after a heart attack, independent of their cholesterol, their blood pressure, and the usual kinds of things. That's how powerful these things are. When at Yale, they did a study, and they gave people a questionnaire before they did a test to see how much blockage they had in their arteries. And they found that the more love and support they felt before they had this test done, the more they felt loved and supported by their spouse or their significant other, the less blockage they had in their arteries, independent of their blood pressure, their cholesterol, and other factors. That's how powerful these approaches are. And when you're depressed, your immune system is depressed. Study after study has shown that your natural killer cell activity and T and B lymphocyte activity are downgraded when you're feeling depressed. Your immune system doesn't work as well. As in a striking example of that, here at UCSF, they found that men and women who were HIV positive, who were depressed, had more than double the chance of developing AIDS and dying from it than those who weren't. That's how powerful these things are. Well, what can we do about that? And that's where I think Salesforce can come in. You know, there's been a radical breakdown in the social fabric of our country in the last 30 or 40 years. You know, people don't have a job that feels secure. They don't have a neighborhood where you have 2 or 3 generations of people. They don't have a church or synagogue they go to regularly. They don't have an extended family or even often a nuclear family that they spend a lot of time with. And here again, we know those things affect the quality of our lives, but they actually affect our survival. But what can we do? This was a study done at Stanford by David Spiegel. And he took women who had metastatic breast cancer, and he randomly divided them into 2 groups. Both groups got the same chemo and radiation and surgery. But in addition, one group of women met together in a support group for an hour and a half once a day to talk about what it's like to have breast cancer with women who really understood because they were going through it too, in a safe environment where you could really let down your emotional defenses and just be authentic about what's really going on in your life. He just did that for 1 year, once a week for a year, 90 minutes. 5 years later, those women were found to live twice as long. He said he almost fell off his chair when he saw that. Now, a skeptic might say, oh, come on, give me a break. You mean sitting around with a bunch of people and talking about my feelings is somehow going to help me live longer if I've got cancer? Come on, please. But that's what the data show. Because we are touchy-feely creatures. We are creatures of community. That's what the cloud is all about. That's what what social networking is all about. And yet the level of social networking that we see is really superficial compared to what it really can be. You know, when you're in an extended family, people know you. You know, they don't just know the good stuff you've done. They know all you. You know, they know when you've messed up, and you know that they know, and they know that you know that they know, but they're still there for you. And so, you know, our Facebook friends are nice, but they're generally, it's a pretty superficial level of intimacy compared to what can be done. Now, I gave a talk at the Army War College last month where they trained the 4-star generals to be in all 4 branches of the military. And I talked about the power of love at the Army War College, which had a bit of a Dr. Strangelove quality to it, but it was fun. And I've done that now for the last 4 years in a row. And I mentioned to them that, you know, 18 veterans kill themselves every day, and 1 active duty soldier commits suicide every day because, again, depression is so epidemic, but particularly in the military. So I asked General Stan McChrystal, a 4-star general who's retired now, to make a video because I figured he'd have a lot more street cred than I would coming from, as a California doctor, a 4-star general talking about the power of love. And here's what he made for me. I'm going to just play it for you.
Dean, this is Stan McChrystal. Thanks for letting me be a part of your presentation today on the power of love. It's not something you'd normally hear in a military gathering, but I don't think it's inappropriate. I go back to my early days in my career, and I think all of us experienced this. There were leaders who would use negative or coercive leadership, sometimes through fear or intimidation, to try to get us to do whatever it is they wanted us to do. What I found through experience, and it was first taught to me by Major General Bill Garrison, was that no matter how much fear we create in subordinates, that's just not strong enough to force them into actions when they're more scared of something else, particularly a situation like combat. When the chance of being injured or killed by the enemy is great, any fear they have of their chain of command is likely to be very insignificant. What we find, of course, is that in the end, soldiers react to what they feel strongly about. They react to positive leadership, they react to positive values, they react to a positive environment created around them, and they react to a positive example from leaders that they respect and leaders they care deeply about. In a sense, soldiers do what they feel strongly about, and it really gives to the idea it's the power of the positive aspect. It's they do what they want to do, not what they're scared to do. So I think the power of love is appropriate. Thanks, Steve. All the best.
Thank you. So here again, fear is not sustainable, but love is. And, you know, you can try to scare people all you want, but you're not going to be able to scare them as much as somebody shooting at them does. So if they fear you, they're not going to be nearly as effective as a soldier. But if they love you, they'll die for you. And that's true in anything. That's the power of love that we're talking about here. Love is healing. Now, there was a major study that came out by Nicholas Christakis in the New England Journal of Medicine a few years ago. And they looked at this in relationship to how it affects our behavior. The yellow dots are people who are obese, and you can see that how they cluster. And what he found was that if your friends are obese, your risk of being obese is 45% higher. If you've got fat friends, you're more likely to be fat. If your friends' friends are obese, your risk of obesity is 25% higher, even if you've never met their friends' friends. And if your friend's friend's friend is obese, your risk is 10% higher, even if you've never met them as well. That's how powerful these social networks are. But they work in both directions. Like any kind of power, they can be healing or they can create problems. They also saw this with smoking and drinking and depression, but it's also been seen with preventing epidemics like the ones that Larry talked about, as well as with making you happy and altruism. And the social distance is much more important than geographical distance, which brings us to the cloud. Because anything that creates trust, which is what Mark talked about in his keynote, and intimacy, which is really what social networking is all about, is healing. Anything that creates intimacy is healing. Healing comes from the root to make whole. Yoga comes from the Sanskrit, to yoke, to unite, to bring together. These are very old ideas that we're rediscovering. And it also creates meaning. And when you have a sense of meaning, then anything it creates a much greater sense of resilience to stress and a hardiness to stress when we create meaning in our lives. I was profoundly depressed when I was in college to the point of being suicidal. I found I could take the meaning out of anything. But I also learned that we can put meaning into things by creating the kinds of things that we're talking about doing here. And to that extent, Salesforce.com itself can be a healing experience. You all know that it can help you be effective in the business world. But really, the business world is just an example of human-human interactions. And that's what Mark talked about so well in his opening keynote a few days ago. So anything that brings us together is healing. Anything that brings us together creates meaning. Anything that creates trust creates intimacy, because you can only be intimate to the degree you can make yourself vulnerable. You know, we all have these walls that protect us, you know, because there's mean people out there. But if you have nowhere that feels safe enough to let down your emotional defenses, and no one that you trust enough to be open and vulnerable to, then those same walls that protect us isolate us. And we've already seen that isolation increases our risk of premature death and disease by a factor of 10 in some cases. And so when we can bring that sense of trust and meaning and intimacy to our customers, as well as to the people that we care most about, it makes us much more effective in business, but it makes us something that your customers aren't going to forget. Because the need for intimacy is as primal as the need for food and air and water. I don't know of anything in medicine that has as powerful an impact on our health and well-being as the need for connection and community and intimacy. And when you can meet an unmet need in business, then you can create a great success, even if you don't meet it all that well, if it's primal enough. I mean, look at Starbucks, you know, the lounges in Starbucks. It wasn't the coffee, it was that they brought people together. Early on, the chat rooms in AOL, or what Larry was doing with The Well, you know, bringing people together is powerful. You know, most people's Facebook friends, it's not the most intimate of life experiences to chat on Facebook, but even that you can create, you know, 1 billion different members, as we learned a few days ago. And so when you can meet an unmet need that's as primal as the need for connection and caring and love and community and meaning and trust, that will make you much more successful, but it brings meaning because you're not just making money, you're creating a healing experience for the people that you interact with. And if you look at all of the spiritual traditions, they all have, you know, lots of different things that people fight over. But when you get to the essence of it, what Aldous Huxley called the perennial philosophy, it's all about altruism and forgiveness and compassion and love. What do those things all have in common that bring us together? I remember the very first study that I did 35 years ago as a medical student. I had 10 men and women in a hotel for a month. And one of them was a guy who hated gay people, and of course one of the other men was gay. And so when they first met, the guy said something insulting to the other. He said something equally insulting back. One got chest pain, took a nitroglycerin. The other got chest pain, took a Demerol. They both slammed the door. I thought they're both going to die, and this is going to be the end of my very short research career. But I talked to them. I said, you're giving the power to give you chest pain and maybe even a heart attack and die to the guy that you hate the most. That's not really smart, even from your own self-interest. And so we need to get away from this idea. Is it selfish or is it unselfish to be forgiving, to be compassionate, to be altruistic? Look what Mark is doing with the Benioff Children's Hospital. That's something that gives him great meaning, as it gives great meaning to all of us who support that. So I talked to them and I said, I want you to be more compassionate with each other. Not that it condones or excuses what this guy is doing, but it frees you from the suffering and the pain of having that hatred. Because hatred, as it turns out, is the most toxic emotion, not just to the other people, but to you. And so when you bring people together with Salesforce.com, you transcend those differences and you create a sense of healing. I gave a talk years ago with this man named Swami Satchidananda, and people said, what's the difference between healing and between illness and wellness? And he went up to the board, he wrote the word illness and circled the word I, and wellness and circled the word we. That sense of I is something that makes us separate and lonely and isolated and depressed, is what leads to illness. But what brings us together, including the kinds of things that the tools that Salesforce.com promotes wellness and healing. And ultimately, we're all going to die, as I mentioned earlier. So to me, the more important question isn't just how long we live, it's how well we live, and how we can use the experience of suffering as a doorway for transforming our lives and the lives of the people around us. So when you use these powerful tools from Salesforce, think about it in the larger context. Spend an extra minute or two, talk with people that you interact with. Say, what's going on in your kids, and what's going on in your marriage, and what's going on in your work, and how can I help, and how can I serve you? Because that will not only make you that much more successful in business, but it will allow you to use that opportunity every day that you come in contact with someone, either face-to-face or virtually, as Tony Robbins will talk about as well, as an opportunity for creating meaning and healing in our lives. And that, to me, is what makes it all worthwhile. So thank you so much for the chance to be here today. Appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.